So really great to be here. I'm Naveen. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Terviva. Terviva was formed in 2010. I will mention a little bit more about our Larta connection in a couple of minutes. I'm going to talk about four things. What we do is the first thing. I will talk about why we do it. I'll talk about Larta and the ecosystem around ag tech. And then I've got four pieces of wisdom I think we've gathered over about a decade as it relates to the interface between the public sector and private sector and raising money for startups. So what does Terviva do? So we are a company dedicated on a single new crop. The crop is a tree called Pangamia. You can think of the Pangamia tree as like soybeans growing on a tree. So if you've seen an almond tree or a pistachio tree, it's very similar to that. It's just got soybeans on the tree. The beans are full of oil and protein. Chances are you've never heard of this tree before. I would put it in the classification of what we call indigenous or frontline community crops. It's not one of these mainstream crops like you've heard of, like corn or soy or wheat or rice. It's in the class of about a dozen or 24 other crops that are very commonly found around the world in frontline communities. And these crops are typically planted in these frontline communities for two reasons. The first is that the crops grow really well on poor quality soils with very minimal inputs. So erratic availability to moisture, typically don't require a lot of fertilizers and things like that. They also had some anecdotal value. So in the case of the Pangamia tree, these beans, the oil in the beans have medicinal properties to them. And so the beans were used in Eastern medicine and in Ayurvedic medicine. So when Terviva came to being about 10 years ago, we were trying to tackle two particular problems. The first is that, as I think we all know, agriculture is a big contributor to climate change. So about 20% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are related to agriculture. And a lot of that, if you look in that detail, a lot of that is related to actually the livestock production system. So we grow about 200 million acres of corn and soybeans in the US. We don't even grow anything close. We don't even eat as humans directly anything close to 200 million acres. The vast majority of that goes toward feeding animals, and a big chunk of that actually goes toward biofuel. So we need new types of ways to grow crops, to grow traditional crops, as well as perhaps new crops in a less carbon-intensive way. The second issue we have in the agriculture system is that agriculture is vulnerable to climate change. So these crops that I mentioned, corn and soybean, they're grown in very high concentrations around the world. The vast majority of our corn and soy, as an example, is grown in the United States and Brazil. And when you have droughts or when you have flooding, you have these supply chains that are really, really vulnerable. So we launched the Pangamia tree because we saw a different way to grow oil and protein on a tree, on degraded land, where we're not actually concentrating the risk. We're growing this tree all around the world, in particular in smallholding farmer communities where you need farmers to grow different types of crops in one field. When you grow a tree, you have the advantage of being able to do other things on that field, underneath the tree and around the tree and so forth and so on. So takes a really long time to build a company like this. As I might have heard me mention earlier, this isn't really a modern crop in the sense of like things like palm and wheat. And so we had to do a lot of breeding and development work to get the tree to yield pretty consistently on poor quality land. And as I mentioned, the beans have medicinal value. They are very bitter. So we had to invent food processing to debitter these beans so we could use them for things like food and animal feed. So that's kind of the bit about Terviva. Let me just jump forward. You can see products here are already in the market. We've brought a edible oil, and we'll still be bringing an edible flour from Pangamia into the US market. We're building supply chains of these beans. There's big existing supply in India today. We're also growing new acreage of Pangamia on degraded land. I'll talk a little more about that later. This is our supply chain. Coming to the Larta portion of our journey. So we became a Larta portfolio company in, I think 2012. At that time, we were less than 10 people. We won a National Science Foundation grant to begin to build a molecular marker breeding platform on Pangamia. The analogy I like to use is if you're familiar with 23andMe, they take a little bit of your saliva and they tell you a lot about you. We built the same thing for Pangamia to start our Larta money. When you're trying to develop a new tree crop, it takes a really long time to observe what's happening in the field. we were able to actually accelerate that through a molecular markers program that related the Pangaea genome to other genomes like soy, cowpea, pigeon pea, peanut, and some other crops so that we could very quickly determine what was happening in the field through a markers platform. So really invaluable early support. Fast forward from that point, I think at that time we probably had raised less than $2 million of capital. We were included in Rohith's Ag Innovation Showcase in 2013. This was at a time where you could probably fit all of the people in the ag tech community in one room. Han Chen was in that room with me at that time. Quite literally, Rohith, I think, probably the Larta Institute invented the ag tech community as it stands today. Since that time, we have raised over $100 million of capital to build out what we have going here. Which brings me to my last point, and I'm definitely over time. What have we learned in trying to raise all of that money, about $130 million of capital, including about $3 million of that coming from the public sector over the last 10 years? And how would we apply that going forward? So 4 quick things. As we've seen this space evolve over and over, we've often seen it neglect what I call the simple solutions. Sometimes the simplest solutions are those that we need to actually solve our climate issues in the space of agriculture. Recently, I've been reading about large vacuum cleaners that are sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. It's called direct air capture and storing it underground. Trees are the original carbon dioxide sucking things of the world, right? So, and per ton of CO2 sequestered, trees are incredibly affordable. So I say go with trees, not with large vacuum cleaners, if we want to sequester carbon. So the simple solutions really matter. Increasingly, I see public dollars going to the more kind of, esoteric, complex things. The second thing I would say is that we need to take everybody into consideration as we build out this climate tech ecosystem. So a lot of the impacts of climate change and agriculture are going to be felt in these frontline communities. They're going to be felt in developing countries. We pioneered a really great model a couple of decades ago related to pharmaceuticals, where developed nations typically spend premiums for drugs and medicines, and developing countries spend less. We're going to need something similar related to climate tech to get it to scale in emerging markets. Third thing, we really need to think practically about how these types of technologies scale up. This is not software. We are deploying hard assets and sometimes biological assets into communities, and just because you get one project done, it does not mean that the next project is turnkey, or the project after that, or the project after that is turnkey. Every single community in which you go has different circumstances. These technologies need to be connected in very intimate and direct ways into those communities. And so we need to continue to support different types of deployments of these technologies all around the world. Which brings me to the last point, which is that we need to have tremendous patience to see these technologies scale. I am so delighted to see all of the success that the Larta Institute is having. This is a very, very difficult market right now. Some of you might know for climate tech startups, the capital is not there. We climate tech startup companies, I like to say we're developing 2 of the most commoditized things in the world, calories and electrons. These are things that for 100 years, the petroleum industry and the soybean industry and the corn industry and the palm industry have had a lot of time to perfect. It is going to take us at least a couple of more decades for our technologies to be as economically competitive. And so we need that patience. So that's it. I'm definitely over time. Congratulations to Rohith and the team for the continued success. I'm so glad we need it, and thank you for having me.